Lovely to see you. I'm Beth Webb, and I'm a storyteller, and I'm an author. This one is called Nyangono the Fisherman, and it was written by a very dear friend of mine, Beatrice Fribimi, who is a Cameroonian author. And although this story comes from Lake Victoria, which isn't in Cameroon, it's sort of central to Eastern Africa, Beatrice collected it for her wonderful book of lake myths called Mystique. And the link to the book will be with this video when I've finished. And so this is a wonderful story I got from her book, Nyangono the Fisherman. There was once a fisherman who lived by the shores of Lake Victoria, and he was very poor. He could scarcely feed himself, let alone afford a wife. And so he was really struggling when there was a drought, and the waters of the lake went down and down and down, and he had to walk further and further to put up his nets. Sometimes he didn't get anything at all, and of course nothing was growing in his patch of ground outside his hut, and he was so hungry. But one particular morning, one particular night, when he was asleep, he dreamed of a feast. Oh, it was a wonderful feast. Food he hadn't even imagined. Food he'd never even dreamt of, all set out in front of him, and everybody from the village was there. But the Fon, the chieftain of the village, didn't seem worried about starting eating. He was just talking to his friends, and poor Nyangono was so hungry, but he didn't start until the Fon started, until the elders of the village started. And so his mouth was dribbling, and his stomach was rumbling. And then he woke up. Oh, he was so hungry, but he had nothing to eat. Well, he looked out of the window, and it was almost dawn, so he thought, well, I might as well go and see if the spirits of the lake have given me a fish today. And so he got dressed and he walked down the path and across the dried mud flats of the lake. And then he waded into the water and he went to his nets just as the sun was rising. And to his amazement and delight, the net was heavy. And he started to pull. And he thought, this is a really big fish. Or perhaps it's a car tire. Well, he kept hoping, and the net started to wriggle, and he thought, no, it's alive. And he pulled, and in the morning light he saw not a fish, but an old lady. And he started to untangle her very carefully. Now, the people of Cameroon, this is by the by, but it is relevant, make the best chocolate in the world. And they love to compare their skin colour to chocolate. Now, Nyangono himself was the colour of 95% beautiful, rich, dark chocolate. But this old lady was what they call chocolat, which means milk chocolate. And she'd got long, black, silky hair and green eyes. And everybody Nyangono knew had short, black, curly hair and dark eyes. And so he knew for certain that this was a spirit being from the lake. And so he was very respectful and very careful as he unwrapped her. And he was about to let her go back into the lake. And she said to him, please, Nyangono. How does she know my name? Well, she's a spirit being. Please, she said, Nyangono, take me home. Give me something to eat. And Nyangono said, you're welcome in my house. It's only a mud hut, but I have nothing to eat. I've had nothing to eat for a couple of days now. And she looked at him and smiled and said, trust me. And so Nyangono gave her his arm and helped her up, away from the lake, up the lane to the house. And all the way she seemed to uncurl and straighten until in the morning light, as he showed her his little mud hut, he realised she wasn't as old as she'd thought. She was about his age and quite beautiful. And he took her into the hut and said, well, I can get you some water to drink, but that's all I've got. And she smiled and said, I told you to trust me. And she opened a bag she'd been carrying, and in it was fish and potatoes. And she said, you go and get some water, and I will cook. And so he went to get fresh water from the lake. And when he came back with his jar of water, there was a wonderful stew of fish and potatoes. Oh, Nyangono ate and ate like he hadn't eaten for months. Well, he spent the rest of the day talking to this lady. Her name was Chumve, which means salt. And as they talked, he realised he just enjoyed having company and somebody who didn't look down on him for being poor. And that night he gave Chumvei his bed and he slept on the floor in the main room of the hut. And next morning, Chumvei said, Nyangono, instead of going fishing, I want you to build a cattle pound, a big fence to put cattle in. And Nyangono said, but I have no cattle and the ground is so hard, I can't possibly build something like that. And she looked at him and she said, trust me. And so Nyangono went out and he took his axe and he found some old dry wood because nothing was growing, and he cut it into long fence posts, and with a lot of blood, sweat and tears and blisters on his hands, he put the posts into the ground, which was as hard as brick. But by the end of the day, he built a large fenced area about half a mile from his house. And he went back and once more Chumvei had a wonderful meal ready. And he thought, this is amazing. I like having this lady living here. And in the night, he dreamt that he heard mooing and the sound of many hooves. And when he woke up in the morning, he looked out of the window, and up on the hillside, in his cattle pound, were several dozen large red cattle, fat and sleek. And Nyangono said, Chumvei, quick, come and look. And she smiled as she followed him up the path to the cattle pound, and there were the finest cattle Nyangono had ever seen. They'd fetch a fortune at market because everybody's cattle was so thin and hungry. Well, he was now a rich man. And even more miraculous, the field beyond the cattle pen was green with lush grass. And so he let the cattle out and let them feed, and he took them down to the lake to drink. And that night, Chumvei said, tomorrow I would like you to build a goat pen. A goat pen? But I have no. And Chumvei said, trust me. And so it went on day after day. There were goats, there were sheep and chickens. And now Nyangono was a wealthy farmer, and he had food on the table every day, and he had money. And so he asked Chumvei to marry him. He could afford a wife now. And so he built himself a fine house and a compound, and a little separate house for Chumvei, for that is how things are done in Cameroon. And they got married, and they were very happy. And Chumvei was not only good company and seemed to produce the most wonderful food, but she was wise. And she thought of an idea which would please the spirits of the lake, and that would end the drought. And so Nyangono went to the elders of the village and said, I think we can end the drought by making sacrifices to the lake. And he told them Chumvei's idea. And the elders thought it was wonderful. But Nyangono never said it was Chumvei's idea, which was not good. But as time went on, although they were very happy and very wealthy, Chumvei was a little too old to have children. And the elders of the village said, come, Nyangono, you need children. Take another wife. You can have as many wives as you can afford, as you like. You can afford them. And so he talked to Chumvei, and she said, I think I know just the girl. And the following day, Chumvei bought a beautiful girl called Caribou to meet Nyangono. And Caribou was young, and she was pretty, and she was intelligent and lively. And so they agreed they would get married. And Chumvei was happy with this because that's the way things are done in Africa. And so Nyangono had a house built for Caribou. And over the years she presented him with 2 fine daughters. But again the elders said to Nyangono, you are a wealthy man of standing in this village, and you still have no sons. What's an African man without sons? And so Nyangono thought, yes, I do need sons. And so this time, without talking to Chumvei or to Caribou, he went out and he discussed with the elders who would be a good wife. And someone recommended a young girl called Ashanti, who was pretty and young and bright-eyed and was very happy to marry Nyangono because he was so rich. Well, the marriage went ahead. A new house was built in the compound. But then trouble began, for Ashanti had a sharp tongue, as sharp as knives, and she had a bitter edge, and she stirred up dissent and anger and unhappiness in the compound. And soon Nyangono was miserable. Neither Caribou nor Ashanti wanted to feed him, because there was always rows, and he ended up eating with Chumve. He never even said thank you to her. He just turned up, ate miserably, and then he went away without saying thank you, and everybody was miserable. And I'm afraid he took to drink. And one night he went out and he got very, very drunk and very cross and very miserable. And on the way home, he tripped over and he hurt his leg. And when he tripped, he dropped the key to his compound, but he didn't see it in the dark. And he staggered home. He was drunk, he hurt, his head hurt, and he felt sick. And he went up to the compound gate and realised he got no key. Oh, this was a disaster. And so he thought, what am I going to do? And he started banging and rattling at the gate. Let me in, you good-for-nothing wives. Nobody came. It was just dark and silent. He went round to the backs of his wives' houses and bashed on the windows. Let me in, Ashanti. Let me in, Caribou. Let me in, Chumve. But nobody stirred. It was like everybody was dead. So he went back to the gate and he rattled it again. And then he started shouting and yelling and said, you're useless. What's the point of having 3 wives? I have no sons. You've been no good for me. And Chumve, you're the worst of all. I was perfectly happy before you came along. And then he heard the gate open. And in the moonlight, he looked up. And Chumve looked down at him and said, I thought we were happy. I thought when I came to you from the lake that I had found a man I could love and respect. But you have ignored me. You have mistreated me. You have insulted me and abused me, and I'm not having it. In the morning, I'm leaving you. Well, Nyangono was too drunk to care or even think. He didn't even say sorry. He staggered to his bed, and despite the pain in his leg, he slept. But in his dreams, he heard the mooing and the bleating, mooing of the cattle and the bleating of the goats and the clucking of the chickens, and he heard footsteps and whispers. And in the morning light, he got up, and he stood at his gate in horror, for there was Chumve and Caribou and Ashanti walking down to the lake's edge with the goats and the sheep and the cattle all following behind. And the waters parted, and the women and all the cattle and everything Chumve had given Nyangono went into the lake, and the waters closed over them. And it was still. The lake woman had taken back all the gifts she had brought him, and had taken it back. And Nyangono stood by the edge of the lake, leaning on his stick, crying and wailing and saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Chumve, come back. Ashanti, Caribou, please come back. I didn't mean it. I'm so sorry. And he leant on his stick and cried. But there was nothing but the rippling of the water on the shore. And he stood there so long, Nyangono turned into a tree. And if you go to the edge of Lake Victoria now, you will see an old twisted tree that looks just like an old man leaning on a stick. And so thank you, Beatrice, for that story.